2010 at 3 o'clock for the purpose of discussing the advertising of the superintendent's position, which will become effective July 1st. Carol's not here today, and she wanted it to be recorded for us, so if no one has an objection, we'll be recording this meeting. Before we start the meeting, let's stand and say the pledge to the flag. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I think all of our board members know Dr. Call, except maybe Rob Baker. Baker is one of our newer board members, and I'm sure Steve, you know Steve Priestley.
We go back a long way.
Yes. So I think everybody knows each other, and we'll just turn the meeting over to Dr. Call.
Well, I do want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a bright, beautiful day outside. We're certainly glad to get rid of some of this snow. At least we are in Turtles, but we probably didn't have as much as you did. I have some booklets I would like to pass out. There's one for each board member. I did bring some extra copies, one or two. There's one for each board member. And I'll give you this to you, Carol. And just apologies. This booklet allows you to go through the process that we use for, typically we use for selecting a superintendent. And it goes from the very initial start, the initial phase, all the way through signing the contract for the superintendent. Now, there's various tabs here, and under these tabs you can see different things that we might want to discuss. Since your board has been under state control for a few years, what I think we might want to do is go over the responsibilities under tab number 1 for a superintendent, because you will be in a different position once you start working with a new superintendent beginning in July. So under the first tab, it's called tab number 1 here, there are several things I think we want to consider. And these sometimes escape the notice of county board members and superintendents even. The first thing we have to realize, this is a little bit of philosophy now before we get into some of the details. The superintendent's role is a constitutional role. The superintendent is indeed a constitutional officer. County boards are in no way mentioned in the Constitution except for one area. And that area came in 1986 when the legislature determined through a constitutional amendment that there could be no more than 2 county board members elected from the same magisterial district. That all came about because there was a court decision made by the state Supreme Court, Darrell McGraw, who wrote the decision. He said it's wonderful that we have this magisterial district limitation, but it's not in the Constitution. So the legislature in 1986 added that to the Constitution. The other thing in statute, and this is very important to remember, it doesn't say that the superintendent is the CEO of the school district, but it uses the word acts as the CEO of the school district. Of course, the superintendent is elected by the county board. We use the word appoint now, although elected is really the right word, I think. And the superintendent, and you'll find this out once you have direct working relationship with a superintendent that you help select, they have what's called referent or positional power. In other words, the role of the superintendent is different than that of the board because of who they interact with. Dr. Payne, for instance, he can call a meeting of all the superintendents in the state, and thou shalt be there. And there are other roles and responsibilities as well. Typically, the superintendent will go to Rotary meetings. Typically, they will represent the board at the state board meetings, SBA meetings, and things of that nature. So that's another thing to consider as well. You have the power as elected board members, and you soon will have the power as elected board members to bring a kind of a political accountability to the school system. The people elect you as board members to bring their thoughts and their ideas into the mix of things in a system which largely could operate without you. In other words, if there were no school board, the system could largely go on its own, but it would not have that important ingredient of political accountability. So that's another thing to remember as well. Why I mention that is your role and that of the superintendent vary because they have the educational expertise, they have the knowledge, they have the training to look at problems differently than you do as elected board members. You may see problems from a community angle. In other words, you may say, this is what the community wants, or this is how the community feels, whereas educationally, that sometimes is not always the best philosophy of policy. So that's another thing that's important as well. Lastly, in this first part, over the years, there's been and it's come about for different reasons, there's been quite a development in thought about the role of the board and the superintendent under board superintendent relations. It used to be said that the superintendent implemented the policy done by the board. It used to be said that the board set policy, you turned it over to the administration, they implemented the policy, and you had kind of a very, very distinct roles. And you didn't want to cross those roles because if you did, you would get over into the M word or micromanagement. Under the new way, I think, of thinking, there are so many complex issues anymore that it's kind of a blending. You don't want to get into day-to-day operations as a county board, and a good superintendent will keep you from it. And he is the leader of the board, or she is the leader of the board. But there is a collegial relationship between the board and the superintendent and how you approach problems and things like that. That's all been brought about because of No Child Left Behind, Local 21, an increasingly scrutinizing legislature, loss of monies, dollars, that sort of thing. That's kind of all come together to help promote this idea. And then board superintendent relations, they're also dependent on a number of local issues as well. How you as a local board approach problems, that varies per board. In some boards, what you might consider micromanagement, again, may not be considered micromanagement by a board and superintendent in another context in another county. So another thing that affects board superintendent relations is the local aspects of things as well. And then you get into what's expected of board members, what you expect out of the superintendent, all those sort of things. Some of that's written, some of that's unwritten. Some of that may be said openly, some of that may be said in quieter manners, but you have a certain way you develop, you work toward working with your county superintendent. Then on the next page, and these aren't numbered, I'm sorry for that, usually we number them, but for some reason these aren't. When you get into, and now we're moving into the meat of our meeting, when you get into selecting a superintendent, you have several things that guide you. Number one, you do have the code of West Virginia. It gives you a lot of direction. It says who can be employed as superintendent or elected as superintendent. It says how many years they can serve. It says who sets their salary, when it has to be done, what kind of degrees they have to have, what their roles and responsibilities are. All these things are determined in code. But you have what's called local policies. You have also a vision statement your board, I'm sure, does. You have a mission statement, you have policies that you have all these things that really relate to a great degree on what the qualifications are and the characteristics and the things you would like to expect out of your superintendent. So one thing we need to do before we get started is, as we start in this process, find out what your mission statement is, your vision statement, your goals, your policies that affect the superintendent relationship. Now, I know that Neola does most of your, I think they do your policies if I'm not mistaken, so they will have policies in these areas, and then your 5-year plans and all sorts of things. That basically tells us what you're going to expect not only of yourselves as a system, but what you're going to expect from the superintendent as well. So that helps us get started there. And then when you go to choose a superintendent, you have to consider several factors, like what are the demographics of the county? What are the county financial needs? How is the county off financially? What are some emerging needs? Technology may be one, retaining teachers may be one, working within the school aid formula, that's basically finances, morale may be one, all sorts of things like that. And that leads us into personnel considerations. You may have some questions along those lines. And then, of course, another big factor is your involvement